For most of the last century, physiologists agreed on a number: 5,000 metres. Above that line, the human body does not simply struggle, it stops keeping up with itself. Weight falls away and does not come back. Sleep breaks into pieces, the blood thickens, and it stays thick. That number was never meant as a summit. It was a ceiling, the altitude above which a community cannot hold. There is a town in southern Peru that sits above it. Not a camp, not a research station, a town, with streets, with shops and generators and schools and children born there. It clings to the side of a mountain called Andean in the far south of the Peruvian Andes, between 4,900 and 5,300 metres above the sea. Above it hangs a glacier. The people who live beneath it call her the Sleeping Beauty. The air here holds roughly half the oxygen of sea level. Barometric pressure falls to around 400 millimetres of mercury against 760 at the coast. The average temperature across the year sits close to 1 degree above freezing. Nights fall to -11. Nothing grows. Not a tree, not a field. Not 1 calorie of what is eaten here is produced here. There is no sewer, there is no river you can drink from. There is no soil deep enough to bury the dead. And by the most cited estimate, as many as 50,000 people live on this mountain. Both of those things are true at the same time. The number the science gave, and the town standing on top of it. Nobody was forced up here. No empire marched them. No border trapped them. Every person on that slope climbed 1,300 vertical metres to get there, and most of them arrived in the last 25 years. So what is inside this mountain that is worth the ceiling? Gold. That is the short answer, and it is the answer almost every story about this place stops at. A gold town. Metal and the people who chase it. But the gold explains only one thing. It explains why anyone came. It does not explain the rest. It does not explain why the houses are sheet metal instead of timber, why the water arrives as ice, why the rubbish never rots, why the dead go down the mountain and the successful go with them, why the town sits at 5,100 metres and not 300 metres higher, where the ore is just as rich. Every one of those answers comes from the land. This is a place where the terrain wrote the terms and the people signed. Not out of ignorance, out of arithmetic. And there is a line on this mountain that nothing crosses. Not the grass, not the potato, not the tree. You can see it from the road, a soft edge across the slope where green gives up. The town is 900 metres above it. Hold that, we will come back to it. Above the last houses, on ground where the wind never fully stops, something is already grazing. The vicuña is the smallest of the 4 Andean camelids, and the wildest. It has never been domesticated. It moves across the high grasslands in small family bands, and it climbs to 5,200 metres, higher than the roofs of the highest town on Earth. It solved thin air by a different route than the people below it. Its hemoglobin binds oxygen far more tightly than ours. Where the human answer to altitude is to carry more blood, the vicuña's answer is to take more from every breath. Same mountain, same air. 2 completely different solutions, arrived at by 2 completely different clocks. The vicuña's coat is the finest natural fibre in the world, and it very nearly cost the animal everything. By the middle of the 20th century, hunting had pushed the species toward collapse. Protection and community shearing brought it back. It grazes now above the mine road, indifferent to the trucks. It has been solving this altitude for a very long time. The people have had about 14,000 years. To understand a town at 5,100 meters, you have to start much lower and much further south. Between the two great spines of the Peruvian and Bolivian Andes lies a floor. Not a valley, a floor. 600 kilometers of it, running north to south, sitting at an average of 3,800 meters above the sea. The Altiplano, the largest high plateau on Earth outside Tibet. Nearly 3 million people live on it. That is the fact most outsiders never absorb. Before you reach the strange town on the mountain, you have to accept something stranger and much larger. In this part of the world, an altitude that would put a European tourist on oxygen is simply where the buses go, where the markets are, where the cities sit. Puno, on the shore of the lake, at 3,819 meters. Juliaca, 3,825. El Alto, across the Bolivian border, above 4,100, with a metropolitan population approaching 1 million. Cerro de Pasco, further north, 4,330, the highest city of real size in Peru. And at the center of the plateau, holding it all together, a lake so large it makes its own weather. Lake Titicaca covers more than 8,000 square kilometers. It is deep, and it is cold, and it is enormous. And that mass of water is a thermostat. It absorbs heat through the day and releases it through the night, and it softens the frost across the plain around it. The old agricultural heartland of the Altiplano exists because the lake refuses to let the temperature swing as far as the altitude says it should. So the people of this region did not learn altitude recently. They have been at it for roughly 14,000 years, since the first bands moved up onto the plateau and stayed. Which raises the question this whole story turns on. If the Altiplano is where the high-altitude world already lives, why would anyone climb another 1,300 meters above it? The answer was made 400 million years ago, and it was not made here. Long before there were Andes, there was a coastline. The western edge of the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, quiet, drowned, collecting mud. For tens of millions of years, sand and silt slid off that margin into deep water and settled in layers. Those layers are still here. Geologists call them the Ananea Formation. Lower Paleozoic sediments, hardened into slate and quartzite, and the town takes its name from the same word. Then the margin was squeezed, the rock folded. Under pressure and heat, deep in the crust, water was driven out of the minerals and forced upward through fractures. That water was not clean. It carried silica, sulfur, arsenic, and gold, dissolved in trace amounts, moving through cracks kilometers below the surface. Where the pressure dropped, the fluid let go of what it carried. Quartz crystallized into the fractures in sheets and lenses. Gold came out of solution with it. Along the crests of the folds, where the rock arched and pulled apart, the veins swelled into thick pods the miners of this belt still call saddle reefs. This is orogenic gold. It does not form near the surface. It forms in the zone where rock stops shattering and starts flowing, somewhere between 5 and 15 kilometers down. It is made in the dark, under a mountain range, and normally it stays there. Which is the strange part of this whole story. Not that the gold exists, where it is now. Because the range that made it eroded away, and a second one rose in its place. Off the coast of South America, the oceanic Nazca Plate slides beneath the continent. It has been doing so for tens of millions of years, and the crust above has thickened, shortened, and buckled in response. Most of the height of the central Andes was gained between roughly 10 and 6 million years ago, somewhere between 2,300 and 3,400 meters of surface uplift, geologically fast. The gold did not rise to meet anyone. The mountain carried it up. Everything that happens on this slope, every tunnel, every shack, every truck, every thickened bloodstream, happens because a body of Paleozoic ore that formed kilometers underground was lifted, by an accident of plate tectonics, to an elevation where the human body begins to fail. Remember that. It is the whole answer, and we are nowhere near ready for it yet. The road ends at a wall of corrugated iron and grey rock, and above it there is ice. Mount Ananea rises past 5,800 meters. Draped across its shoulder is a glacier, a long, reclining mass of ice that from the valley below resembles a woman lying on her side. La Bella Durmiente, the sleeping beauty.
She is the reason the town is possible. She is also the reason it is dangerous.
At this altitude, in this part of the Andes, there is no groundwater worth the name. The rock is impermeable slate. The ground is frozen for much of the year. Rain falls in a short summer season and runs off almost immediately. And for the long dry months from May to September, precipitation nearly stops. There is no well to sink. There is no spring below you because you are already above almost everything. So the water comes down. Meltwater runs off the ice in channels and hoses, and it feeds the settlement, the ore washing, and the drinking pots. Households catch what they can from their roofs when it rains. That is the supply. Ice above and sky. A glacier is not a lake, it is a bank account. It stores the snowfall of decades and pays it out slowly, which is why glaciated valleys have water in the dry season when unglaciated ones do not. That reliability is what allows a town to exist on rock where nothing else does. And a town on rock where nothing else exists has to put its waste somewhere. There is no sewer here. Trenching one would mean cutting a network through frozen slate at 5,000 meters, in a settlement that was never planned, on a slope that is being tunneled from underneath. It has never been done. There is no landfill either. At this temperature, decomposition slows to almost nothing. The bacteria that break down organic matter in a temperate climate barely function in permanent cold. Rubbish here does not rot. It accumulates. It stays exactly as it was left, year after year, and the town has been accumulating for 4 decades. So the waste sits on the slope, and the slope drains downhill, and the drinking water comes from above it, for now. Every drop of water in the highest town on Earth falls out of a single body of ice. Hold that too. Because of everything this town does to that mountain, what it does to the ice is the part that travels furthest. On the boulder fields above the tunnels, something is watching the road. The vizcacha looks like a rabbit that has been redrawn by someone who had only heard one described. Long ears, a long curling tail, dense grey fur. It is not a rabbit at all. It is a chinchilla relative, and it lives in the cracks of the rock. Its adaptation is not in its blood, it is in its geography. Rock at this altitude absorbs an enormous amount of solar radiation during the day. The ultraviolet index here can climb past 15. Stone soaks that up and holds it, and the crevices between boulders stay warmer than the open air for hours after the sun goes. So the vizcacha does not fight the cold. It moves through the day the way a person moves through a house, out onto the sunlit face in the morning to bask, back into the warm dark before the temperature falls. The terrain is its heating system. It survives by knowing exactly where the mountain keeps its heat. Every living thing up here is doing some version of the same calculation, including the people. The difference is that the vizcacha has never been asked to do it indoors. Now come back down the mountain and find the line. Andean farming does not simply get harder with altitude, it ends. Below about 4,000 meters, the plateau grows what it has grown for millennia. Potatoes above all, hundreds of native varieties selected over thousands of years for frost tolerance. Quinoa, barley, broad beans. Push higher and the crop list shortens fast. Around 4,200 meters, in the best-sited fields, you reach the practical limit of cultivation. And what survives there is not really a potato in the sense a European supermarket would recognize. It is a bitter potato, grown to be freeze-dried rather than eaten fresh, laid out in the night frost and trodden by foot over successive days until the water is gone and the toxins with it. That is the ceiling of agriculture on this continent. Not a soft edge, a hard one, set by frost frequency and by the number of days warm enough for a tuber to swell. There is a second line above it, and it belongs to the trees. The quinoa is a small, twisted, red-barked tree with papery layers of bark that peel away from the trunk in sheets. Those sheets are insulation. They trap air against the wood and hold the day's warmth through a freezing night.
It is the highest growing tree on Earth, and in sheltered pockets of the Andes, it has been recorded above 4,900 meters. Even it stops before this town does, which is why there is not one plank of local timber on this mountain, and why a settlement of tens of thousands is built entirely out of imported metal. Above it, one thing still works: animals. Alpacas and llamas graze the bofedales, permanently wet peat meadows fed by seepage and meltwater, cushions of green in a landscape of grey. A bofedal is the only reliable pasture at this height, and Andean herders have managed them for thousands of years, cutting channels to spread water and keep the mat alive. So the land above 4,200 meters has one economy, and it is old, and it is thin. You do not farm here. You keep animals, and you move them. La Rinconada sits 900 meters above the last field. There is the line. It runs across the slope below the town, and the town is entirely, permanently, on the wrong side of it. Which means every sack of rice, every crate of beer, every potato, every plank, every drop of diesel, every egg arrives on a truck. Not as a convenience, as the only mechanism. A settlement of tens of thousands of people feeding on a road. Take the road away for a week and the mountain empties. And yet the mountain gave the gold away twice. The first delivery is the one inside the rock, the veins, the reefs, the tunnels chasing them. The second was made by ice. For most of the last 2.5 million years, the glaciers on this range were far larger than the strip that remains. They ground across the ore-bearing slate, and they did what ice does. They broke it, milled it, and carried it downhill. Gold is soft, and it is dense, 19 times the weight of water. When ice-crushed rock is later moved by meltwater, the light minerals wash on, and the gold does not. It drops out and concentrates in the gravels. That is a placer deposit, and the plain below Ananea is full of them. The result is a landscape that has been turned over twice, once by ice, and once by people following the ice. The gravels around San Antonio de Poto have been dredged and sluiced for generations. And the drainage that leads east off this range carries fine gold all the way down toward the lowlands of Madre de Dios, hundreds of kilometers away in the Amazon basin. So the Geology delivered a hard version and a soft version. Rock you must tunnel for, and gravel you can wash. And that is the detail that explains why anyone was ever up here at all, long before the first sheet of corrugated iron went up. Because you do not need a mine to find gold in a river. You need a pan, and patience, and a reason to be cold. There is one way in. From Juliaca, on the plateau at 3,825 meters, the road runs northeast across open puna, past herds and wet meadows and small settlements, and then it begins to climb. Roughly 3.5 hours, unpaved for most of its length, 1,300 vertical meters of gain, most of it in the last stretch. In mountaineering, that ascent profile is a warning. The standard advice above 3,000 meters is to sleep no more than 500 or 600 meters higher than the night before, and to give the body days to adjust. Here, people do it in an afternoon, on a truck, with their belongings. And the same road carries the traffic in the other direction, which is the part that tells you what this place actually is. The injured go down it because there is no hospital at the top. A serious accident means hours on a mountain road before a surgeon sees you. The dead go down it because the ground here is rock and ice and there is no cemetery on the slope. And the successful go down it too. That is the pattern that gives the town away. A miner who has a good month, and then another, does not build a better house on the mountain. He buys one in Juliaca, 1,300 meters lower, where there is running water, and a hospital, and air his children can grow in. Success here is not measured in what you build, it is measured in how fast you can leave. So who stays? Start with what the town is made of, because at this altitude, the terrain chooses the building.
Material before anyone else gets a vote. There is no timber. The tree line in the tropical Andes tops out around 4,000 meters, and even that last stubborn woodland, the twisted, paper-barked kenua, cannot reach this slope. So nothing here is built of wood. The houses are sheet metal over a frame, roofed in more sheet metal, weighted with stone. Metal is a poor choice at 5,000 meters. It holds no heat. Overnight temperatures inside an uninsulated iron room fall to the temperature outside, which for much of the year is well below freezing. There are no chimneys because there is nothing local to burn. Fuel comes up the road in cylinders and drums. There is no plumbed water because there is no pressurized source and no buried pipe network. Water is carried in drums and buckets and jerry cans from meltwater channels and collection points. There is no sewer for the reasons the rock already gave. And there is no grave because you cannot dig one. Each of those is not a failure of planning. Each is the arithmetic of the site. And the air itself changes the smallest details of a day here, in ways that have nothing to do with breathing. Water boils at 100 degrees at sea level because that is the temperature at which its vapor pressure matches the weight of the atmosphere above it. Take away nearly half that weight, and the water needs far less heat to push back. At 5,100 meters, water boils at somewhere close to 83 degrees. Which means a boiling pot up here is not hot enough to cook the way a boiling pot is meant to. Beans and grains that take 20 minutes on the plateau take an hour or more on this slope. Every meal costs more fuel, and every liter of fuel came up the road on a truck. Fire behaves differently too. Combustion needs oxygen, and there is half as much of it, so flames burn cooler and dirtier, Stoves run poorly, and engines lose a significant fraction of their power simply by being here. And then there is the sun. Ultraviolet radiation is filtered by the atmosphere, and there is far less atmosphere overhead. On this mountain, close to the equator, the ultraviolet index can climb past 15, and higher still around midday in the wet season, into a range most of the world never experiences. Snow and pale rock reflected back upward. It comes at you from below as well as above. So people here cover their faces. Wide hats, cloth, layers. Not against the cold alone, against the light. Cold, thin, bright, and dry. 4 separate conditions, all produced by the same single fact of elevation, all of them rewriting something as ordinary as lunch. But the compounding is worse than the sum. Human waste on a slope with no sanitation goes into the ground and into the runoff. The runoff joins the meltwater. The meltwater is the drinking water. Cold slows bacterial decay, so the contamination does not break down the way it would lower down. It persists, through a dry season, into the next wet one. The rubbish behaves the same way. There is no collection. Plastic, tins, batteries, tailings, the residue of ore processing. It all stays on the mountain, and the mountain is steep, and everything on a steep mountain eventually moves down. The lake in the middle of town is not a lake in any natural sense. It is a low point that has filled with what the settlement has produced. And still, the population climbed. Between roughly 2001 and 2009, as the price of gold multiplied, the settlement grew by well over 200%. Estimates for the population range from about 30,000 to as many as 50,000, and no census will ever land it precisely. This is a town people arrive at on a truck and leave on a truck, and thousands of them are not registered anywhere on this mountain at all. Every one of them came from lower down, from the Puno provinces, from Azangaro and Sandia and Ilave, from Arequipa, from Cusco, from Madre de Dios, which means that almost nobody in the highest permanent settlement on Earth was born at this altitude. They are highlanders, genuinely, deeply, generationally adapted highlanders, from 3,800 meters. And that difference of 1,300 meters turns out to matter more than almost anyone expected. The mountain was worked long before the road existed. The valleys east of here, Carabaya, Sandia, running down toward the forest, were known for gold for centuries. The people of these slopes, herders and travelers and healers, moved between the high grassland and the warm valleys below, and knew exactly where the rivers gave up metal. And when the Inca state expanded south and east, it took note. The gold of Carabaya enters the imperial record. The province is folded into the eastern quarter of the empire. Gold becomes the property of the state, worked, carried down, turned into vessels and offerings that were never meant to be worn by the people who dug them. Then the Spanish crown arrives, and the same valleys are catalogued again, and worked again. But here is the detail that matters, and almost nobody repeats it. In the Titicaca region, the high workings ran roughly 4 months a year. 4 months. That was the season. When the weather closed in, the workings stopped and the people went down. 2 empires, one with unlimited conscripted labor, one with the wealth of half the world, looked at these mountains, took the gold, and did not try to stay through the year. They understood something about this altitude that the modern town decided to test. Follow the water off the ice and it collects, first in threads, then in shallow lagoons scattered across the high plain. Some of those lagoons hold flamingos. The Andean flamingo feeds in salt and mineral lakes up to around 5,000 meters. Water so cold, so alkaline, so hostile that almost nothing else uses it. Its bill is a filter of extraordinary fineness, built to strain microscopic diatoms out of the shallows. It eats the one thing the water will reliably grow. Flocks stand through nights that freeze the surface around their legs and lift at dawn in slow lines against the grey. It is the rarest of the world's flamingo species, and its whole existence rests on a narrow band of high, salty water that is now shrinking as the glaciers that feed it retreat. It survives here for the same reason the town does, because something at this altitude is available and nothing else wants it. Now follow that water further. The stream that leaves the foot of the Ananea ice has a name: Lunar de Oro. It runs down off the mountain, gathers others, and becomes the Rio Ramis. The Ramis is the largest river flowing into Lake Titicaca. Roughly 250 kilometers from these headwaters to the lake shore, which means the highest settlement on Earth sits at the top of the water supply for one of the most densely populated highland basins in the Americas. And the way gold is separated from crushed rock here is with mercury. Mercury binds to gold, forming an amalgam that can be picked out of the sludge. To recover the metal, the amalgam is heated, often in an open pan, often with a blowtorch, often inside the settlement itself. The gold stays. The mercury boils away into the air. Vapor rises. It cools. It condenses on the coldest surface available. That surface is the glacier. The ice above the town collects what the town burns beneath it, and the ice is where the drinking water comes from. Studies in the Ramis Basin have documented elevated mercury and other heavy metals in the headwater streams and sediments below these workings, and mercury has been measured in the blood of people living here, children among them. Downstream, the metals move mostly as suspended sediment during the flood season, spreading into a basin that farms, fishes, and drinks from that river all the way down. And Lake Titicaca has no exit worth the name. More than 90% of everything that enters the lake leaves as water vapor. Whatever comes down the Ramis and does not settle in the riverbed stays in the basin. And the Ramis is only one of the two ways off this range. North and east of the workings, a second drainage collects into Lake Suches and runs out along the Rio Suches, a river that forms part of the border with Bolivia before turning south toward the same lake. Two countries, one watershed, one set of headwaters. Whatever happens on this mountain does not stay on this mountain. It is simply a question of which valley it takes on the way down. There is no downstream. Not really. The mountain is at the top of a system with a lid on it. And then there is the question of who carries the cost of all of this and how it is paid. The system most of the men on this mountain work under is called cachorreo. It is not a wage. Under cachorreo, a man works for the mine owner for a fixed period without payment, commonly 30 days, in some accounts 25. At the end of it, for a few days or sometimes a single day, he is permitted to carry out as much ore as he can lift on his own back, and to keep whatever is in it. Sometimes that is a good month's earnings in an afternoon. Sometimes there is nothing in the rock at all, and the month is simply gone. There is no contract. The agreement is verbal. There is no compensation if the tunnel fails, and tunnels here do fail. The rock is fractured slate, the workings are informal, and a serious injury means hours on the road to Juliaca and beyond before anyone can operate. The International Labour Organization describes cachorreo plainly as a form of labour exploitation, and it has existed here since the settlement began. It is worth saying clearly what that means in practice. A man climbs to 5,100 meters, works underground in an oxygen-starved atmosphere for a month, and then finds out afterwards whether he was paid. The lottery is the wage. And the women of the mountain are barred from the tunnels entirely. Not by law, by belief. There is a long-held conviction on this slope that a woman underground brings bad luck and empties the vein. The mountain itself is female here, called Awicha, grandmother, and the gold is hers to give or withhold. So the women work outside. They are called palaqueras, and they go over the discard piles, the waste rock thrown out of the tunnels, breaking it, sorting it, looking for what the men missed. They work in the open, at 5,000 meters, on the tailings, for whatever is left in the stone. That is the arrangement. It is not ancient, and it is not inevitable. It is 40 years old, and it is what happens when a settlement grows faster than anything that might have governed it, on ground too high and too remote for anyone to bother climbing up to look. The land did not choose that. People did. But the land is why nobody came to stop it. Above all of it, riding the same slope on a column of warm air, is the animal that refused to pay for altitude at all. The Andean condor has a wingspan approaching 3 meters and is among the heaviest flying birds on Earth. At this elevation, the air is thin enough that generating lift by flapping would be close to impossible for a bird that size. So it does not flap. It waits. Slopes like Ananea heat unevenly through the morning, and the air above them rises in columns. The condor launches into one, spirals upward without a wing beat, then glides down the gradient toward the next. It can cover enormous distances on almost no muscular effort, scanning the ground for carrion. It solved the mountain by refusing to fight it. Everything else here pays for altitude in blood, or in heat, or in food. The condor pays in patience. In the Andes, it has been a sacred animal for thousands of years, the bird that carries the world above, the messenger between what is up there and what is down here. It circles over the tunnels now, and over the tailings, and over the palaqueras working the waste rock, and it has been circling over this particular mountain for a very long time. For most of the 20th century, the question of how high people can live was treated as a question about people. Physiologists went looking for the ceiling inside the human body. They measured lung volumes and hemoglobin and oxygen saturation, and they assumed that somewhere on the curve there would be a hard number where the machinery simply stopped. The place they went to look for it was a volcano in northern Chile. Cerro Aucanquilcha stands at 6,176 meters. Near its summit, from 1913, men mined sulfur, for decades the highest working mine on Earth. A road switchbacked almost to the top. Before the road, llamas carried the ore down. 4 men were recorded living at around 5,900 meters. That is the highest permanent human residence ever documented, and it was a metal hut. But the detail that made physiologists sit up was not the hut. It was the behavior of everyone else. The workers would not sleep at the mine. They lived several hundred meters lower in camps down the mountain and climbed to the workings each day. A hard ascent in thin air before a shift of heavy labor and then back down again at the end of it. They were offered accommodation at the top. They refused it, repeatedly.
And they were not lowlanders being cautious. Most were Andean highlanders, born between 2 and 4,000 meters. They had run an experiment nobody designed, and the result was clear. Above a certain altitude, the body cannot recover overnight from the work of the day. You can labor up there. You cannot sleep up there and keep doing it. In 2002, the physiologist John West set out to establish what the highest permanent human habitation actually was and why. He named this town in southern Peru, then far smaller than it is now, as the highest permanently inhabited settlement in the world. And his conclusion about the ceiling was not the one the field had been looking for. The limit, he argued, is not set purely by human tolerance to thin air. It is set partly by whether there is a reason to be up there at all. That is the sentence that reframes everything on this mountain. The ceiling of human settlement is not a physiological constant, it is a negotiation. On one side, the damage the altitude does to the body. On the other, whatever the land is offering in exchange. Almost everywhere on Earth, the land at 5,000 meters offers nothing. No soil, no fuel, no shelter, no route to anywhere. The exchange fails, and the ceiling holds. Here, on the side of Ananea, the exchange does not fail. Because of an accident in the Paleozoic and a second one in the Miocene, this particular slope has something in it worth more per kilogram than almost anything else on the planet. The mountain made an offer no other mountain at this height can make, and 50,000 people accepted it. Now here is what the acceptance costs. In 2019, a French physiologist named Samuel Vergès began bringing scientific teams up the road from Juliaca. The program is called Expedition 5300, and it is the first sustained medical and scientific study ever conducted in the highest city in the world. Vergès had spent his career on hypoxia, how the body copes when oxygen runs short, and he had reached the limits of what expeditions could teach him. A climber at 5,000 meters is a visitor. What he needed was a population. More than 80 million people worldwide live above 2,500 meters. But there is only one place on Earth where a whole community lives permanently above 5,000. The program exists because of a second name. Ivan Hanko Zirena grew up on the Puno Altiplano and trained as a doctor. He worked as a physician here, on this mountain, treating the people in the sheet metal town, long before anyone was measuring them for science. When he met Vergès at a meeting in the French Alps, the two of them realized what the other one had. Hanko went to Grenoble to do a master's and then a doctorate. And the study that followed was possible only because the town already trusted the man asking the questions. Among the people who volunteered was a man named Hermilio Sucacer. He owns a house here. It has no heating, no running water, and no sanitation, which in this town is unremarkable. It describes almost every house on the slope. To measure the total mass of hemoglobin in his body, the researchers had him breathe a trace of carbon monoxide from a bag and rebreathe it for a few minutes while they tracked how it bound to his blood. It is a standard laboratory technique. It is normally done in a laboratory. Here it was done in a sheet metal room at 5,100 meters, on a man who lives in it. That is what the science of this place actually looks like. Not a machine, not a satellite. A man breathing into a bag, in his own house, in the coldest, thinnest air any settled human being has ever agreed to live in, so that somebody could finally put a number on what it does to him. Hundreds of residents did the same. The town is the instrument. What they found is not a story about how well the human body adapts. It is a story about what adaptation costs
when you take it past the altitude it was built for. Start with the blood. At sea level, a healthy adult male carries roughly 14 to 17 grams of hemoglobin per deciliter of blood. In the residents of this town, the average measured is around 20.3. In those diagnosed with chronic mountain sickness, it reaches 23.1. That is not a small shift. That is blood carrying nearly half again as much hemoglobin as a body at the coast. And the total mass of hemoglobin and the total volume of blood rise with it, without any iron deficiency to explain it away. The body is doing the obvious thing. Less oxygen per breath, so build more carriers. And the obvious thing has a price. Blood that is thick with red cells is blood that flows badly. Measured viscosity in these residents is substantially higher than in people at sea level, and higher again in those with chronic mountain sickness. The heart is pushing a heavier fluid through the same vessels every minute for years. Overnight, oxygen saturation collapses. Expedition 5300 found that nocturnal hypoxemia here is severe and close to universal. It does not spare the healthy. Around 3/4 of even the cognitively healthy participants reported poor sleep. In the most affected, blood oxygen spends a significant part of the night below 65%. Chronic mountain sickness is the name for what happens when this compensation runs away with itself. Excessive red cell production, severe low blood oxygen, headaches, breathlessness, sleep disruption, neurological symptoms, and in time, cardiovascular failure. The treatment is to descend, permanently. Roughly 1/4 of the people living on this mountain have it. At Puno, 1,300 metres lower, the figure is under 5%. 1,300 metres. That is the entire difference between a highland population that is fine and a highland population that is failing. And the reason why is written into 2 clocks on opposite sides of the world. There are 3 great high-altitude populations on Earth: the Andeans, the Tibetans, and the Ethiopian Highlanders. All 3 solved thin air. None of them solved it the same way. Tibetans have held ground above 4,000 metres for something on the order of 44,000 years. Andeans, Quechua and Aymara, for roughly 14,000. 30,000 years is a very long time to be a species under selection. And the results diverge exactly as you would expect from that gap. A Tibetan at 4,000 metres carries hemoglobin at close to sea level concentration. Their adaptation runs through ventilation, through blood plasma volume, through the oxygen-sensing genes of the hypoxia pathway. A set of solutions that gets oxygen to the tissue without thickening the blood. The Andean answer is more direct and cruder. Carry more hemoglobin. Selection signals have been found in the same oxygen-sensing genes in Andean populations, tied to higher hemoglobin and to higher aerobic capacity in thin air. It works. For 14,000 years, on a plateau at 3,800 metres, it has worked extremely well. It was simply never tested at 5,100. And at 5,100, the solution begins to turn on the body carrying it. So put the whole chain together, because this is the answer to the question this began with. 400 million years ago, mud collects on a drowned continental margin. It hardens into slate. The margin is squeezed,
Hot fluid moves through the fractures kilometers underground, and gold crystallizes out into quartz veins in the dark, at depths no human being will ever walk to. 10 million years ago, the crust west of here begins to thicken and rise. The central Andes gain most of their height in a geological blink, lifting the whole package, slate, quartz, gold and all, by thousands of meters. 2.5 million years of ice grind at the top of it and spread a second, softer version of the same treasure across the plain below. 14,000 years ago, people walk up onto the plateau beneath, and their descendants slowly become a highland people, with thick blood and enormous lungs, and a body built for 3,800 meters. And then, in the last 40 years, the price of gold climbs high enough that the exchange finally works. And those people, carrying an adaptation tuned for the plateau, climb 1,300 meters past the altitude it was tuned for. That is why 50,000 people live higher than anyone else on Earth. Not because they are tougher than everyone else, not because they chose the view, not even, really, because of gold. Because a tectonic accident put something valuable above the line where the human body stops fully repairing itself, and the body's own best answer to altitude, the one that took 14,000 years to build, turns out to have a ceiling of its own. They live at the top of the mountain and slightly above the top of themselves. There is one more thing on this mountain that is changing, and it is the thing everything else depends on. The Sleeping Beauty is shrinking. Glaciers across the tropical Andes have been losing mass for decades, and the Cordillera Apolobamba is no exception. Satellite analysis of the ice above this town, tracked year by year from the mid-1980s, shows the glacier cover falling as the mining footprint expands, and the correlation between the two is strong. Part of that is the warming climate that is thinning tropical glaciers everywhere. Part of it is local and direct. Rock dust and soot darken the ice surface, and dark ice absorbs sunlight that white ice reflects away. Tunnels have been driven through the ice itself to reach the rock beneath. A glacier that is being mined and shaded and dirtied melts faster than one that is only warming. And a shrinking glacier does something counterintuitive on the way out. At first, it gives you more water, not less. The melt season runs harder and the streams run fuller. Then the ice becomes too small to sustain that discharge, and the curve turns over, and the dry season flow begins to fall, and keeps falling. Glaciologists call that point peak water. Beyond it, the account is being drawn down rather than paid out. Which sets the real clock on this settlement. Not the ore. There is ore left in Ananea. Not the price of gold, which will do whatever it does. The water. A town that exists because a glacier stores the snowfall of decades in a place with no aquifer and no river above it, has exactly as long as the ice does. And for all its strangeness, this town is not alone up there. It is simply first, and by a longer margin than most people assume. The next highest settlements on Earth are in Tibet. Tuiwa at 5,070 meters, Chasangkun at 5,011, Rongbuk Monastery under the north face of Everest at 4,980. A religious community, not a town, and one that empties in winter. All of them small, all of them thinly populated, all of them lower. In Nepal, Lobuche sits at 4,940, a cluster of lodges on the trekking route rather than a town. In Bolivia and Chile, there are mining camps that have gone higher and did not last.
Nowhere else on the planet is there a permanent population of tens of thousands living above 5,000 meters. Not one. This is a category with a single member. And that is not because nobody else was willing to try. It is because nowhere else did the land ever make the offer. At the edge of the settlement, where the last sheets of metal give out and the rock takes over, something moves along the scree at dusk. The culpeo is the Andean fox, the second largest wild canid in South America, thick-coated, grey and rust, with a stride built for broken ground. It hunts vizcachas in the boulder fields, and birds, and whatever the mountain leaves out. Its range across the Andes traces the vizcacha's range almost exactly, and the vizcacha's range traces the rock. Follow the fox, and you are really following geology, 3 animals deep. But the culpeo above this particular town has learned one more thing. It has learned that where people are, food is discarded, and this settlement discards a great deal, and none of it decomposes. So the fox works the edge, not the wild edge, the human one. It is the last adaptation in a mountain full of them, and the newest by many thousands of years. The vicuña adapted to the air, the vizcacha adapted to the stone, the condor adapted to the wind, the fox adapted to us. Perhaps that is the truest measure of what has happened on the side of Annunea. Not the tonnage, or the population figure, or the record. The fact that in 40 years, a settlement appeared at an altitude where nothing had ever settled, and became a permanent feature of the ecosystem, something the local wildlife now has to account for. The people here are not reckless. That is the thing outsiders get wrong most often. They made a calculation with real numbers on both sides. Below, on the plateau, a life with clean water and a hospital and a school, and very little chance of ever earning more than the plateau pays. Above, thin air, cold metal, thickened blood, 30 days of unpaid work, and a lottery ticket in the rock. Every single person on that mountain ran that sum and came to the same conclusion. That is not madness. That is arithmetic, on ground where the arithmetic is brutal. And the land wrote both columns. It made the gold, kilometers underground, 400 million years ago. It lifted the gold into the sky, 10 million years ago. It stripped away the soil and the trees and the air, and left a slope that can offer a person exactly one thing and nothing else at all. We tend to imagine that the map of human settlement is drawn by choice, that people live where they want to live. Stand on this slope and it looks like something else entirely. It looks like the land making offers and people answering. Almost everywhere at 5,000 meters, the land has nothing to offer, so the map is empty and the ceiling holds. Here, for one accident of geology, on one mountain, the offer was good enough. And so the highest line that human beings hold on this planet does not run along a summit, or a border, or a frontier of exploration. It runs across a slope of grey slate in southern Peru, under a glacier named after a sleeping woman, at 5,100 meters. It is held by people who climbed there, and it will hold exactly as long as the mountain keeps its side of the bargain. Thanks for watching. Until the next journey.